Welcome to the Sherman Report. Here's Peter Sherman.
Welcome to the Sherman Report for Friday, August the 16th. Great guests coming along, one in a moment and one later on. But to kick off the show, we'll have somebody interesting for you, I promise. And then later on, some comments from a real radio pro who you'll know and know about what looks like a lot of the beginning of the end of radio to me. Anyway, we'll talk about that later. Now, a few days ago, Joe Oliver wrote in the Financial Post about what he calls 4 endgames now in play and how they're going to change the world. Joe has been a high-value observer for many years. I'm not talking well today, but it'll end. You'll remember him as the Finance Minister of Canada under Stephen Harper, and he was a good one. And on the subject of good ones, we'll be joined later, as I was saying, in the show by John Donabie. If you've been a faithful follower of radio in its day, John was on the air as a host in Montreal at one time where we met, but mostly he worked in radio on a whole range of music and talk stations in Toronto, and he knows the business and made a decent living at it. Something that is not often seen anymore as radio tries to change, but seems incapable of doing so. So I'm glad you're with us. Stand by. Joe Oliver will join us in one moment.
Now, the Sherman Report continues.
My old friend Joe Oliver, first of all, I've got to welcome you to the program, and there you are for the world to see. Welcome to the Sherman Report. You spent so much time in government. Some say we're in a precarious place right now in the world, and you've identified 4 events recently in the Financial Post. These are events unfolding currently where each, while not interlocked, could have great consequences one on the other. And they are the American election, the impending decimation of Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party, growing pushback on the climate change issue, and the Middle East crisis, all of which you suggest will inform our lives. And yes, we're all very conscious of these things because they're in our face every single day. So why don't we start on the home front, Joe, and quoting you, a Liberal government in its death throes is engaged in cringeworthy acts of desperation. Justin created space between himself and his finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, recently because, hey, Justin doesn't like to take the blame. And he tried to woo Mark Carney into the tent, and he couldn't do that. Quantify, if you could, the effect on regular Canadians right now as a result of these missteps.
Well, great to be with you, Peter. These are really important issues, and starting with the transformational change I think we're going to have, probably not for another 14 months. We have a government that is really trailing extremely badly in the polls, between 18 and 20%, and much of it is focused on the Prime Minister, who certainly lost his sheen and is disliked, according to the polls, by a majority of the population who would like him to move. So these acts of desperation are they're cringeworthy, but they're sort of extraordinary for the Prime Minister of Canada to use his officials, the Prime Minister's office, the PMO, to publicly chastise his deputy Prime Minister is quite a sign, and maybe that she is on her way out, or certainly is not in a favored status, and she's the number 2 person in the government. The implications of a change, of a political change in this country are I think potentially quite profound, and they relate to a large degree to the concerns that everyday Canadians have about the current government. They relate to pocketbook issues, prices, the inability of first-time buyers to be able to afford a home, and our young people are really devastated by the prospect of never owning a home.
Well, then there's us, the old people. We're going to the grocery store and getting killed. I mean, the prices are insane.
Yeah, they really are. And, inflation has come down, but of course prices have not come down, and they won't unless you have a depression, and no one wants or needs that. We've had a profligate government. The spending has been totally out of control. We have a deficit that's in excess of $1.2 trillion. Our debt obligations on an annual basis are now about 45 billion, and they're moving up to 55-60 billion dollars.
Well, you're the former finance minister, so you're the right person to ask. And it's kind of a dual question. One is, how do you manage to spend that much and hope to ever get the budget balanced again, much less pay down the debt? And how much damage is there for the holder of the keys next time around, presumably Poilievre?
Well, it's going to be a monumental task for Pierre Poilievre when he takes over to right the ship. And it can't be done overnight. But one of the first things I hope he will do is set a target for balance. It can't happen in the next year or two. I'm hoping it might happen during his first term, but at the bare minimum, we have to know that we're going to get there at some point in the intermediate future. And what the signals we've had from the Liberal government, as well as their actions, is that the deficits will continue on forever. And ultimately, of course, that's not sustainable, because at a certain point, the interest on the debt becomes too great to be able to spend money on critical social services like healthcare and infrastructure spending and so on. To say nothing of the military, where we frankly been a deadbeat internationally, and we're criticized by not only the United States but all our NATO partners for not being able to meet the minimum target of 2% of our GDP. We're somewhere at 1.4%.
I'm sorry. You can't go back and fix it just by printing more money or imposing more taxes, because we're kind of at a limit in terms of what we can do as individuals. And the idea of putting more debt on the books simply devalues the money further. And that's the root of inflation, which is causing all the mess that we're having to sustain.
Right. What you have to do is foster more economic growth. That's the way ultimately out of this conundrum. And what we have in Canada, unfortunately, is insipid productivity. The OECD projected that Canada over the next 40 years would have the lowest growth rate in GDP per capita of any other of the wealthy countries, any one of the 35 countries. We're dead last. Now that's really a shameful and very discouraging projection from an outside, expert, independent, objective body. And so we have to do something about improving our productivity. And as we do that and enhance economic growth, we can eventually spend less and start paying down the debt.
Let's hope so. Let me stop you there, Joe, only because we have limited time and we want to get on to the four of these topics that you have cited. And I think you've done an admirable job of describing the pickle that we're in financially. And the two of us talking, we can do that forever. We can't solve it. There's going to have to be somebody new to solve it. So let's move on to the American election, which Canadians are fascinated by. It's a sight to behold. Trump spends the last 6 months, and to an extent, really the last 4 years, being Trump, and Biden blows the debate badly. And then, as if by miracle, some kind of magic cure sweeps Biden from office overnight, literally, and installs Kamala Harris as the nominee, as I say, within about 24 hours. Now, as an afterthought, the Democrats have an upcoming convention, which I guess starts in the next day or two. Does this sound kosher to you, first of all?
Well, the first major problem, and it's shameful because it was inflicted on the American people, was the unwillingness of the people in the know to confront the obvious cognitive and physical decline of the president. It's not his fault, but I do blame him because, in part, for deciding to run again, because he's not so far gone as not to understand that he is in decline and wouldn't be able to function adequately for the next 4 years. And everyone close to him knew that, but they were prepared to overlook it
until they weren't.
catastrophic debate when it became undeniable.
Yeah.
So
Quick question, quick answer on this, and we'll move on to climate change. Do you think a second Trump term is forthcoming? And if so, is that a positive?
well, right now, before Biden's decision to step back from the election, it was definitely roaring ahead to a Trump victory. Now it's much closer, and actually, I noticed that the betting is that Kamala Harris has the slight edge. So there's been a real transformation in the thinking. Now, the critical thing is not, as you know, the total vote, but rather the votes in these key swing states, because it's electoral college that's going to determine it. But the point as to whether it's a good thing or not, putting aside for the moment some of the extreme views of those suffering from the Trump derangement syndrome, which is probably half of America and 2/3 of Canada, there will be some changes for sure, or differences if Trump wins as opposed to Kamala Harris. If he wins, taxes will be lower. There'll be less regulation. There'll be more spent on the military. It'll be drill, baby, drill. Less support or subsidies for green energy. The border, which Canadians don't think much about, but is a very big deal in the United States. The border will likely be closed. Illegal immigrants will be deported. They can't deport all 8 million, but this will be a very big issue. There'll be more conservatives appointed to the Supreme Court. So there will be a very major economic and cultural shift if he gets elected. On the other hand, if she does, not only will those things be different, but I think we're looking at an administration which may be the farthest left in American history. So
that would be an interesting thing to watch, and not necessarily positive for Canada. But then again, with Trump and the tariffs, who knows what can be positive for Canada and what could be negative. Let me ask you about climate change. On the climate issue, you say 1/3 of the mainly Western world governments are spending trillions of dollars to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, which they fervently believe will eliminate the problem of climate warming, that poses an existential threat to humanity. They say, is this going to happen, and is it a realistic approach?
Well, no, it isn't. Whether you believe there's an existential threat to humanity or not, the way they're going about it is simply not working. I mean, I wanted to put it in perspective. It's only 1/3 of the world which is obsessed with this concern. The other 2/3 are concerned about economic development, getting their people out of dire poverty, providing electricity to literally billions of people who don't have it or have energy insecurity and unaffordable electricity. So that's not climate change. So what that means is that 2/3 of the world is not doing anything to reduce emissions, and the result is that emissions last year were higher than they ever have been. So all the efforts, the trillions of dollars already spent, haven't really produced what they are designed to produce. And so that's a very serious issue. At the same time, the public is resistant to the very high cost that this net zero objective by 2050 would result in. But I think what we have to conclude is it simply can't happen in that time frame if it happens at all.
Well,
And there is also a need for people to come clean on some of the hyperbole that is part of conventional wisdom. We've heard recently that we had the warmest temperature in 10,000 years or whatever. Well, those aren't the facts.
That's not true.
I looked it up. This is Government of Canada data. Um, I think it was 33 degrees, last month. Well, if you go back to 1841, the hottest time was in 1936, and 1912 was a close contender. And of all those years, the temperature, there were 89 times that it was warmer than it was this year and last year. So
you know what? I'm going to have to pull the string on this one too, because we're running very short of time. But I'll say this: from the reading that I've done, there's no question that there is climate change. That's what climates do; they change. However, if we want to regulate things to a greater extent, like we believe that they used to be, if we don't believe that this is a cyclical situation that will change again, it's technology that caused this, and it will be technology that changes it back. So we'll leave it at that and find out, I guess. But the last thing that you wanted to touch on, because you touched on it in your article, and it's a big deal, is what's going on in the Middle East. Is that reconcilable? And can we get all of those countries working together and the bad guys, basically Iran and its surrogates, out of the picture?
Well, at least you've identified the critical problem. The West has to stop mollycoddling Iran. Appeasement is the road to war and not the road to peace. And unfortunately, the West is trying to impose a disproportionate standard, a double standard on Israel, which is confronting genocidal enemies. Iran has been open about wanting to destroy the country and kill all its inhabitants, and it's been doing that through its surrogates, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and thousands of rockets and missiles have been sent in. We had the catastrophic and inhumane invasion on October the 7th. And it seems to me this is going to go on until Israel can defeat its enemies and come to peace with its neighbors who are willing. And a lot of them are. But Hamas isn't. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and Hezbollah isn't. But
most of the Arab countries have signified that they would be signatories to the Abraham Accords and create a peaceful region for the first time in history, really.
In history.
And Iran is the thing that's getting in the way. So somebody's got to do something about Iran is the bottom line on that one.
And that goes back to the U.S. election and the question, who do you think would be better to handle that, or even willing to confront that challenge?
Well, we all know where that went and what happened. It'll be an interesting couple of months, next few months. And Joe, I really appreciate it. Joe Oliver, I hope to see you on the Sherman Report again in the future. In a moment, where is radio going? Stay tuned.
Now, the Sherman Report continues.
Okay, if you've been a radio listener for some time in your life, at some time in your life, really, and notably Toronto, but once in Montreal, then you know who John Donabie is. John has a storied career behind him. And when you see him in a moment, those things behind him are CDs because of his vast knowledge of music. Mostly he's worked in jobs where music was the main part of his show, but I've actually worked with John in one instance, at least, at what used to be the premier talk radio station in Toronto, 1010 CFRB. He was just as good as that at that. I wanted to get John on for his history and his understanding of what is now a shrinking medium. And so, John Donabie, welcome to the Sherman Report.
Nice to be with you, Peter. Nice to be with you.
Well, I'm looking at all of those CDs and I'm thinking of your life in radio. And yeah, it was mostly music. But you've worked at, I don't think it's every station in Toronto, but I think it's damn close.
Pretty much. I worked for a Standard under under Standard, then under the Slates, and doing talk radio. I did rock and roll radio for a long time. Came to Toronto again for the Slates, uh, putting Q107 on the air, and worked at Chum FM for a number of years. Worked for CJFM FM 96 in Montreal under the leadership of one P. Sherman.
Oh,
Although
I remember that.
you weren't my general manager, though, when I got there. You came in shortly after when the other gentleman was dismissed.
Yes, and in trying to find out who I was, you asked somebody if I liked rock and roll.
But no, we worked together in Montreal, and now that was a very exciting time. But I've worked Jazz FM here in Toronto. I've done pretty much every format with the exception of classical. I've never done classical music. So
Okay, so here we are, and it's 2024. And yesterday we both read in social media as well as the popular press that I really have to describe it as one of those original legendary stations, CHML,
oh,
Hamilton, the big talk station there, went off the air, just announced that it was time to call it quits. It's part of Chorus, which has fallen on hard times. They have closed down some other radio stations and curtailed activities on some of their radio stations, and they seem to be trying to manage their debt. But in the meantime, some people and some stations have to go. But to see a 97-year-old radio station go by the boards, it makes you wonder because here we are, two old radio guys talking about the old times in radio, but we're doing it on the internet. We're doing it in a privately originated video format and ultimately an audio podcast, this broadcast. We're not doing it on radio, and radio is doing about what it used to do, and it's not selling anymore except to people, say, over 55. Am I right?
I do believe you're right. Those of us who are over 55, I think you and I are roughly in the same age bracket. I still listen to radio myself, but not the way I used to. Here in Toronto, the university station, CIUT, I listen to that radio station. I know some people think it's a dirty word, but I do. I'm a Sirius XM subscriber. I like 60s on 6, 50s on 5. Willie's Road. Huh?
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
And I also like Willie's Roadhouse. I found at my age now, I'm starting to really enjoy the old country that I never would have listened to back in the day. My wife, she programs Seriously Sinatra. So, everything has come down to making it almost niche radio when it comes to Sirius. Most of the radio stations here in Toronto, I can't listen to. And you made a comment one day. So I'm going to follow with that when you said, I don't really care what I say about certain stations. They're not about to hire me tomorrow. It's like people will say,
No.
don't you listen to CHFI, John? I said, I'm too old for CHFI. I've never enjoyed it. When I go to, there's a restaurant locally here I go to, they program it every morning. And I don't recognize a lot of the music. That's possibly my fault. But I don't enjoy it. I found a time when, was it Chum FM and Virgin Radio? I couldn't tell the difference between the two of them. And I got quite bored with that medium. So I was listening to WFUV in New York, WWOZ in New Orleans, internet radio.
Right. And that's what we can do. So, when CHML goes off the air, as it did, and you measure it up, the stations of that ilk would go from, say, Montreal, it would be CJAD, the legendary original for news and talk, CFRB in Toronto, same thing, CKNW in Vancouver. And if you get down to medium-sized markets, you get to the CHMLs. If they're winking out, which is it's a vernacular term I'm using to describe what happened to them yesterday, how long can it be before we see these really big guys say, so, guys, it isn't working anymore, just isn't working anymore? Because you and I, people out there don't, but you and I look at shares. And the share of market, when I arrived in Toronto and I arrived here to run CFRB, it was 15 or 16%. Not only was it 15 or 16% of the market, it was a huge market because there was no competition. There were no Sirius XMs. There were no internet radio stations. You either read the paper, read a magazine, watched television, or listened to the radio. So those stations had free reign. I think the number of news people working at CFRB when I arrived was 12 or 15, and they had dedicated sports people, dedicated weather people, that kind of thing, and they could afford it. Today, that same station has something in a 2 or 3 share range. That means 2 or 3% of the audience. And it's not a big pie that share. It's a little tiny lemon tart.
Yeah.
So how long can you keep going and give people radio? They have no newsroom anymore. They've combined resources because the accountants said they had to with CTV. I'm not slagging CFRB, great heritage radio station, but how do you get younger people under 55, to decide that they're going to listen to radio? You mentioned you never liked CHFI. That's fair. That's not your cup of tea. The only people who listen to CHFI at this point are largely oriented towards female, and they're certainly not much under the age of 45, maybe 50. That's
Right.
just the way it is. Why? Because younger women and younger men, they get Spotify and they pick their music, or Apple Music, or any of the services that are, if not free, then very few dollars, and they don't have to listen to commercials or inane banter. They just go ahead and listen to the music that they want.
Well, you know, with Apple Music, for example, I have 150 playlists that I've created. I've made my own radio station, and my wife will say, who's down the hall in her office, "Oh my God, I've got my own private radio station here, you, John." And that's the way I like to program. But there's something else that's happening that's interesting. These big conglomerates, Peter, are selling these stations off. Probably shouldn't have got into it in the first place. And thank goodness for people like Durham Radio in Oshawa. They've just bought
Yes.
two of the radio stations in Peterborough, and I believe, and they bought a station out in Vancouver. They're getting into their piece of the pie and seem to care a lot more about the medium than the big guys, who should never
They
ever have.
do.
Hmm?
They do, because they're local operators and they care about their town. And in a little town, you might have a weekly newspaper. You likely don't have a daily. So if you had a radio station, and that was what people rallied around, because it read everything from funeral announcements. This is the stuff of small radio. Funeral announcements, whose birthday it is, what events are happening in the local area that particular day or week. Those are the things that people stay tuned to their radio station for. And all of these little stations got into the hands of the big conglomerates, as you call them. I think it's a combination of the CRTC, the bane of radio's existence, decided to concentrate ownership in the hands of the Bells and the Rogers and the choruses and so forth, and they didn't give the little guys a chance. That was a mistake, number one. Number two, they had lousy management. It became accountant managed. So to make the bottom line look better, they threw people over the rails of the ship. And I think, generally speaking, because of the amount of money available, they had to hire inferior talent. So I wonder if radio can ever make its way back as a medium of choice.
I really don't think they will be able to make it back. And just if I can stretch it a bit farther and mix a little TV in here, Peter, is I was talking to somebody. I said, "Did you see the 6 o'clock news last night on CTV?" So what? You still watch that? I said, "Yeah. Why?" He said, "Well, John, I tune on 680 in the morning. That's for those outside of Toronto. All news. They listen to the wheel. They listen to the big stories. They get the traffic, and they're done." He said, "Why do you gather around your television set?" I think those days are gone, John, of sitting around waiting for you to tell you the stories of the day at 6. And, they might have a good point there. I don't know.
They might. Anyway, it seems to me that the station of choice in Toronto, if you happen to be in the car and you really need to know news, is you go to the all news station, because you get it in 10 minutes. And it's not
Yeah.
that I'm banging the drum for Rogers. They provide a service.
They do. They really do. And one of the problems with talk radio, this is personal, whether it's CFRB or 640 or whatever, if you take a topic and you're going to stick with it for 30 minutes, if I don't happen to like that topic, I'm gone. In the old days, a good chance I might come back. These days, a lot of people just do not return to that radio station, Peter, and they go somewhere else.
People like to hear people talk, and people like to hear people talk about the things that interest them.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to do with this little half-hour show every day. And John, you've been very helpful and a friend as always in coming on and talking about radio.
Pleasure.
You're a great part of the Toronto radio history.
Well, it's been a pleasure in this 55-year career that I've had. I've got a lot of iPad, not iPad. What are you on? What system are you on, Peter?
What system am I on?
Yeah, sorry.
I'm on an iMac, and I use an iPad. And what we're doing is we're on a program called StreamYard now.
Yeah, well, I bought a bunch of equipment, some road stuff and so on and so forth. I was all set to go. until this is where I hand it to you. I was told, but there's no one here to help you get guests. I panicked a little. So I have, a couple of $1,000s worth of equipment sitting over here in the corner.
You know what? You look at your old address book and you find out you know more people than you thought. And even the ones that you don't know are usually happy because they like to get exposure.
Yeah.
And I've had no problem getting guests, and I'm delighted that you were one of them today. Have a great weekend.
I appreciate it. You too, sir.
All right. John Donabie of pretty well all the radio stations in Toronto. We'll see you again, John.
Thank you.
Now, the Sherman Report continues.
Okay, just a couple of closing items for you. That was fun. It's good to see John again. Yesterday, I mentioned Mpox. Mpox, you're hearing about that now. I told you it was primarily in Africa, was usually contracted by close contact. Today, we see that Sweden has recorded its first case, but I need to tell you that the infected individual in Sweden was working in Africa. Earlier this year, scientists reported the emergence of a new form, deadlier form of Mpox, which can kill up to 10% of the people that it infects. In a Congolese mining town, that happened, and it was feared that it might spread more easily. Mpox mostly spreads via close contact with infected people, and that includes through sex. I asked yesterday if anyone out there could confirm that one's smallpox vaccination works as well for Mpox. No one has written in, no one has called on that subject. Nobody seems to know, but I get the impression that it's the same vaccine. And since we in Canada and mostly in Western countries, the States for sure, pretty well everybody got a smallpox vaccination at birth, I'm wondering if that's still effective. It's certainly effective against smallpox. Maybe it's effective against Mpox as well. So I'll put the call out again. If you know, please get on the website. There's a comments place. Get on there and comment and tell me why you know what you know, and that Mpox, that we're protected basically from Mpox if we had the smallpox vaccination or not. And one more thing, look at this. The Ukrainians are still inside Russia, and they now control a town, Sudzha. I wouldn't guarantee they're going to hang on to it. The Russians have a few more fighting men, but obviously transportation out there is an issue. And how embarrassing for Russia. They're the guys who started this whole thing. Okay, everybody, have a great weekend. I will see you Monday. I am Peter Sherman, and thanks for being with the Sherman Report.
You're with the Sherman Report. Daily news commentary available at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, with video posted on YouTube and Facebook. Here's Peter Sherman.
Yes, I'm still here, but I should be gone. Have a good weekend.